Under the pale spring sky of upstate New York, Jessica Hart turned the key to a property that had waited nearly 2 decades for her to return. The house wasn't hers by choice, not at first. It had come through inheritance, wrapped in the memory of her late Aunt Rose, a fiercely private woman who had lived and died in solitude, leaving behind a modest lakeside home with a weathered dock and a reputation among the locals for not welcoming visitors. Jessica had only visited the place once as a child, but the tranquility of the lake, the scent of pine, and the way the wind cut clean through the silence had stayed with her. So when the attorney's letter arrived detailing the transfer of ownership, Jessica, recently divorced, professionally exhausted and in search of something quieter than city noise and corporate expectations, accepted the house not as a burden, but as an invitation to rebuild on her terms. The town surrounding the lake, Walden's Hollow, was small enough that the same faces passed every day on the main street. Bakeries shared windowsills with post offices, and people still nodded in acknowledgement without needing a reason. The lake itself was the pulse of the town, a broad, glimmering basin with fingers of private shoreline stretching from the backyards of weathered homes. Jessica's property rested on the quieter, older side, where docks were still made of uneven wood, boats were covered in tarps that had seen too many winters, and fences leaned just slightly as if they were tired but still trying. She wasn't looking for a new life exactly. What she wanted was a life that didn't chase her at every turn. Her job in Austin had been good on paper: urban development, endless meetings, managing projects that changed skylines. But somewhere in that glossy success, she had lost any connection to simplicity. The lake offered a kind of silence she hadn't realized she needed. The first few days in the house passed in a rhythm she hadn't felt in years. Fixing the screen door, sanding the dock, replacing cracked tiles in the kitchen, all small, tactile tasks that didn't demand emails or deadlines. She bought a used fishing boat from a retired mechanic who lived 3 doors down, a soft-spoken man named Cliff who helped her tow it home and refused to take anything more than a cup of coffee in return. The boat wasn't fast or modern, but it floated, and Jessica knew that was enough. She registered the boat, checked the local waterway ordinances, and made sure her dock's registration, left dormant since her aunt's last renewal, was updated and fully compliant. She did everything by the book, not because she feared consequences, but because she didn't want conflict. That was her entire reason for coming here, to live in a way that didn't provoke or attract noise. On the morning she launched the boat for the first time, the lake was smooth like slate. Jessica, dressed in jeans and a windbreaker, untied the moorings with the kind of quiet anticipation that comes with starting something small but meaningful. As she motored slowly across the inlet, taking in the stillness, she felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't felt in years. Ease. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, meet quotas, or prove herself. She was just steering an old boat across a quiet lake in a town where nobody knew her last name or cared how she drank her coffee. But even that peace, as she would soon learn, had boundaries. The first encounter came like a scratch across glass, subtle but impossible to ignore. As she returned to her dock, Jessica saw a woman standing at the edge of the neighboring property, arms crossed, expression unreadable. The woman was impeccably dressed for someone who lived at the lake: pressed slacks, a pastel cardigan, and a visor perched on styled hair. She looked less like someone stepping out to greet a new neighbor and more like a supervisor arriving to inspect a job poorly done. Jessica gave a small, polite wave as she stepped out of the boat and tied it down. "You can't park that there," the woman said without preamble. Jessica paused, blinking. "Excuse me?" "The boat. It's too close to the shared line," the woman continued, pointing down toward the water. "There's an agreement about line of sight. Your vessel is obstructing mine." Jessica glanced at the boat, then at the dock, then back at the woman. The dock clearly fell within her property lines, and the boat was tied well inside the outer marker poles. "This is my dock," she said carefully, unsure how else to explain something so self-evident. The woman offered a brittle smile. That's what you believe, but these old lines get fuzzy. I've lived here 23 years. Things drift. Boats, borders, expectations. You might be new, but we do have standards here. Maybe you didn't get the neighborhood notice. Jessica didn't rise to the bait. If there's an issue, feel free to send something in writing. I checked with the office. The dock is registered and within limits. The woman tilted her head. Some things are about more than paperwork. Community harmony, for one. She extended a hand perfunctorily. Karen Whitmore. I live right there. She gestured toward the adjacent house, one with white shutters and an overly manicured hedge. Jessica Hart, she replied, shaking it briefly. Nice to meet you. Karen's smile didn't change, but her eyes sharpened slightly. I hope it stays that way. Jessica nodded once, then turned back toward the house, not waiting for further commentary. It was a benign exchange on the surface, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. She had been marked. Not as welcome, not as dangerous, worse, as someone out of alignment with the unspoken rules of Karen's version of the lake. That evening, Jessica walked the property line again, just to be sure. The survey markers were still in place. Her dock had been there since the early 80s, permitted under pre-modern zoning laws. She reread the waterway code, her own lease terms with the state, which held claim to a thin strip of the lake's edge, and the dock boundary agreements. Everything checked out. She knew it wouldn't matter. The next morning, a city marine patrol boat drifted up to her dock. She watched from the porch, coffee in hand, as the officer inspected the shoreline, walked briefly onto the dock, then approached her house. Jessica met him halfway. Ms. Hart, the officer asked. She nodded. We received a call. Complaint said there's a vessel moored without proper ID and obstructing navigation. Jessica sighed inwardly. It's registered. I can show you the documents. The officer was polite, apologetic even. I'm sure it is. We just have to check. The inspection was brief, uneventful. Everything was in order. Before he left, he offered a piece of unsolicited but earnest advice. Neighbor complaints like this usually escalate before they die out. Just document everything. Jessica thanked him, returned to her porch, and stared out across the water. The lake no longer looked as calm. She hadn't come looking for a fight. But she wasn't going to be pushed off her own dock either. The following Monday, Jessica woke up to a message from the local permitting office sitting in her inbox. It was brief, formal, and completely unexpected. A review had been initiated concerning her dock and mooring placement, citing a neighbor complaint about potential violations of municipal water access codes. The email ended with a polite reminder to refrain from using the dock or leaving watercraft moored until the matter is resolved. Jessica sat staring at the screen, the morning sun casting stripes across her kitchen table, her untouched coffee, cooling beside her. The air had shifted, subtly but unmistakably. It was one thing to endure snide comments and strained smiles from a neighbor with an overgrown sense of ownership. It was something else entirely to be formally flagged by the authorities for something so clearly in order. And she knew, without needing to ask, who had made the complaint. Still, she didn't panic. Jessica had dealt with red tape her entire career. She understood that bureaucracy wasn't inherently malicious. It just followed momentum, even if that momentum was based on a false premise. She printed out every relevant document she had, her boat registration, her dock lease, her property deed, and her correspondence with the county when she reinstated the dock registration earlier that spring. Then she called her attorney, Stephen Mark, back in Austin. He picked up after the second ring, his voice half surprised. "You already need me?" he said, half joking. "Didn't even get a chance to paint the porch." Jessica exhaled slowly. "We've got a situation. Local code enforcement sent me a notice this morning. They're reviewing my dock based on a complaint. Something about mooring violations and access obstruction. It's nonsense. But it's official nonsense." Stephen asked her to send over everything, which she did while recounting the details of her interaction with Karen. By the time she finished, she could hear Stephen typing. "All right," he said after a moment. "This is manageable. I'll get in touch with the municipal office, but in the meantime, don't engage with her directly. No email, no verbal responses, no sarcasm by mailbox. Just document everything. Take pictures of the dock, the boat, and the lot lines. Time-stamped, geotagged if you can manage." Jessica already had most of that. As a precaution when she moved in, she had taken full scans of the property, including shoreline photos, as part of her due diligence. She followed up with fresh images, capturing the unchanging position of her dock, the boat moored well within her boundary, and the unobstructed passage around it. The lake was wide. There was no genuine navigation issue. But over the next few days, Jessica noticed subtle shifts in her environment. The trail that ran behind her property, rarely used, now had footprints every morning. A neighbor who had smiled at her in passing the previous week now avoided eye contact. One afternoon, a pamphlet appeared on her porch, folded neatly under a rock. It bore a typed headline, "Lakefront Responsibility, Protecting Access for Everyone." No name, no source. Just a set of bullet points, vaguely alluding to new residents disrupting balance. Jessica placed the pamphlet in a file with the rest of her growing documentation. When Stephen called later that evening, he sounded more focused than amused. "I spoke with the clerk at the permitting desk. The complaint was phrased as a collective concern, neighbors plural, which gives it weight. It forces the office to treat it as a broader access issue, even if it's just coming from one person. We're not dealing with a code violation. We're dealing with a perception problem. It's strategic." "Strategic how?" Jessica asked, though she already knew. "She's not accusing you of anything that can be disproved immediately. She's making your compliance appear questionable. That invites investigation, which slows you down and keeps you on the defensive. It's an old trick in local disputes. Keep your opponent busy proving what should already be obvious." Jessica leaned back in her chair, watching dusk roll in over the lake. The water was glassy again, but she no longer trusted its stillness. She had come here for quiet, but now the silence felt engineered, like a curtain waiting to be pulled back on something she hadn't yet seen. Stephen offered to come up and meet with the local office in person if things escalated, but for now, he wanted to see how the inspection played out. He warned her that sometimes people who relied on authority to win their battles didn't always play fair. Jessica understood. The problem wasn't the law, it was the way certain people learned to weaponize it. The following weekend, she noticed the first direct move. Karen had installed a set of reflective poles along the boundary between their properties, extending several feet beyond her yard and stopping just short of Jessica's dock. At first glance, it looked like nothing. A decorative line, perhaps. But the implication was clear. It suggested a border, one that Karen wanted others to assume was real. Jessica didn't react. Instead, she walked the shoreline with her GPS app open, following the original survey markers. Her dock hadn't moved an inch. The poles were well within Karen's property line at the start, but by the end, they crept uncomfortably close to Jessica's side. It wasn't illegal, but it was deliberate. A visual cue meant to provoke uncertainty. The next day, Jessica received a visit, not from the permitting office, but from a man in a green uniform with a county insignia. He introduced himself as Officer Delgado, a waterway enforcement liaison. Polite, professional, and clearly just doing his job, he explained that he'd received a complaint from a resident alleging unauthorized extensions to a private dock. He asked if he could step onto the property. Jessica agreed, walking with him down to the dock where she presented her paperwork and described the sequence of events. Delgado took photos, nodded at the existing markers, and made notes in a leather-bound log. "It's probably nothing," he said, tucking the log away. "But when residents submit repeated complaints, we're required to escalate to an in-person review. You'd be surprised how often this sort of thing becomes a full-blown feud." Jessica raised an eyebrow. Is that what this is? A feud? Delgado offered a non-committal smile. Not yet, but it has the markings. After he left, Jessica stood at the edge of the dock watching a pair of geese drift lazily near the far reeds. Her boat sat where it always did, tethered securely, no part of it in violation, and yet the balance had shifted. She wasn't just a new neighbor anymore. She was someone under observation, someone whose presence had disrupted the ecosystem Karen thought she controlled. That night, Jessica began a journal. Not a legal log, not a digital file, but a handwritten journal kept beside her bed. She wrote down everything: the dates of the complaints, the tone of Karen's voice, the sequence of events. It wasn't about evidence. It was about clarity. If this was going to continue, she needed to see the pattern unfold, and something in her gut told her this was only the beginning. Karen wasn't trying to remove a boat. She was trying to remove Jessica. Piece by piece, paper by paper, complaint by complaint. It was no longer about the dock. It was about dominance. And if Jessica had learned anything in her years navigating city councils and development boards, it was this: dominance thrives in silence. But it can't survive exposure. The key wasn't in fighting louder, it was in fighting smarter. And that she could do. By the middle of May, the quiet tension that had seeped into Jessica's lakeside life began to consolidate into something more aggressive, more coordinated, and unmistakably intentional. What had begun as passive resistance and anonymous complaints was now morphing into an open campaign of pressure. And though no single action could be labeled harassment on its own, the cumulative effect was undeniable. Jessica felt it every time she walked out to her dock and saw new boot prints in the soft ground near the boundary line. She noticed it when packages began arriving late. Some of them left in puddles far from the porch, though the local driver swore he left them properly. And she especially noticed it when a neighbor with whom she had shared several cordial exchanges suddenly crossed the road to avoid her during a walk. The social chill, once subtle, had thickened. It was no longer just about Karen. Others were falling into orbit. The next escalation came wrapped in bureaucracy but carried a sharper edge. A certified letter arrived bearing the county seal, citing an expanded review of shoreline property usage along her section of the lake. The language was dry but deliberate, referring vaguely to community-submitted reports indicating non-compliant shoreline alterations and restricted visibility concerns for adjacent properties. Jessica read the letter 3 times. Nowhere did it name her directly, nor did it reference her by lot or parcel number, but the implications were unmistakable. Karen was moving the battlefield outward. This wasn't just about Jessica's dock anymore. It was about framing her entire presence as a problematic to the neighborhood at large. Stephen confirmed her suspicion when he called the next morning. He'd contacted the issuing department and had spoken off record with an administrator who hinted that multiple complaints had been filed within a narrow window of days. All signed, but suspiciously uniform in phrasing and concern. They're trying to build the illusion of consensus, he said. It's not illegal, but it's manipulative. The goal is to get the county to act, not because of violations, but because they want to avoid community backlash. It's reputational pressure, and you're the pressure point. Jessica wasn't interested in becoming a spectacle. She didn't want to fight a war of attrition in courtrooms or community forums. She wanted her space, her dock, and her peace. But peace, she realized, was no longer a neutral state. Here, it had to be defended, quietly, strategically, and without making herself into a martyr. She didn't retaliate. She didn't confront. Instead, she began to listen, not just to Stephen's guidance, but to the rhythms of the neighborhood, the cadence of whispers passed between front lawns, and the subtle cues of who walked where and with whom. She started keeping record not only of events, but of tone. Who said what? How often they repeated Karen's exact language and how quickly casual greetings dried up. It was during one of those quiet walks, early in the morning with dew still resting on the blades of grass, that she noticed something strange near her dock. A cluster of new markers, small, brightly colored flags, had been staked into the earth just beyond her mooring point. They were placed with precise symmetry, not haphazardly. Each one bore a small tag, a code, a measurement, and the name of a surveying company she had never hired. Jessica stood over them, heart steady but eyes narrowing. Someone had commissioned a private surveyor to chart her shoreline, and had done it without notifying her, or at least without identifying themselves as the client. She took photographs, marked the GPS coordinates, and contacted Stephen that afternoon. He reached out to the firm listed on the tags, and after some initial deflection, they admitted that a local property owner had contracted them to assess encroachment issues related to shoreline structures. They refused to disclose the name, citing confidentiality, but it didn't matter. Jessica didn't need confirmation. She already knew. A few days later, the escalation reached her mailbox. This time, literally. A letter arrived, not from the county or a law firm, but from a so-called Lake Community Preservation Committee. It was formatted to resemble an official notice, complete with a faux emblem and a call to action. The letter stated that Jessica's presence had altered the natural harmony of the lakeside environment, and encouraged her to consider relocation for the betterment of all. It wasn't signed by any individual. There was no return address, just a list of vague grievances and a warning that continued disruption may trigger further administrative responses. Jessica held the letter in her hands for a long time before filing it away. Not because she was afraid, but because it confirmed something she'd only suspected. This was no longer a one-woman crusade. Karen had mobilized others, or at least convinced them that Jessica was worth pushing out. Yet Jessica didn't retreat. Instead, she called the county's Department of Environmental Oversight and asked to schedule a voluntary compliance inspection. The representative, taken aback by the proactive approach, agreed to dispatch an officer within the week. Jessica greeted the inspector with her full file of documents, including recent photos, permits, surveys, and correspondence. The inspection was thorough, clinical, and, more importantly, resulted in a written notice of full compliance. With that in hand, she turned to her own form of quiet resistance. She submitted a public records request to the county office for any and all complaints filed against her property over the past 60 days. The packet arrived 10 days later, thick with duplications but clear in pattern. Most complaints came from the same 3 addresses. The phrasing was nearly identical in each: concerns about water flow obstruction, visual contamination, and non-traditional usage patterns. Each one ended with a recommendation: consider revocation of docking privileges pending review. Stephen reviewed the documents and offered a slow, calculated nod. "This is what we needed," he said. "It's a pattern of coordinated pressure. It's not illegal, but it shows motive. If they push again, we push back, with documentation." The next event, however, was neither documented nor formally reported. Late one night, just past midnight, Jessica awoke to the faint sound of metal scraping near the water. She moved quietly, slipping on a sweater and stepping onto the back porch. The moon was high, casting a dull silver light across the yard. The sound had stopped. But when she walked down toward the dock the next morning, she found 2 of the ropes that secured her boat had been loosened, just enough to drift it several inches from its mooring. No one saw anything. There were no footprints, nothing that could be proven. But it was a message, a warning, subtle but unmistakable. You don't belong here. Jessica didn't call the sheriff. She didn't install floodlights or cameras. What she did was smarter. She replaced the ropes with locking cleats and added a secondary anchor line with a hidden pin. Then she contacted the Regional Water Safety Office and requested a training session on unauthorized watercraft interference. It was the kind of request that sent a quiet signal. I'm not panicking. I'm preparing. And more importantly, I'm not going anywhere. Stephen, sensing the shift, offered a new strategy. They're trying to exhaust you, he said. If you can't be removed by rules, they'll try by pressure. Let's turn their own logic against them. Let's talk about her doc. Jessica hesitated. It wasn't in her nature to retaliate. But this wasn't about vengeance. It was about balance. Stephen explained that Karen's dock had been erected under an old permit, renewed sporadically and likely not updated to modern environmental code. If it was out of compliance, it could be subject to review, just like Jessica's had been. So they filed the paperwork, not as a counterattack, but as a legitimate inquiry, and with that the tide began to shift. Quietly, without fireworks. Just 2 signatures, a notarized form, and a question that couldn't be ignored. Is this doc still legal? Jessica didn't smile when she mailed the packet. She didn't feel triumphant. What she felt was something deeper. Resolve. The first true moment of control she'd reclaimed since this began. And from that moment, everything began to turn. 2 weeks passed before any response came regarding the inquiry into Karen's dock. Jessica had almost started to believe the matter was being quietly dismissed when a plain white envelope appeared in her mailbox, bearing the return address of the county's Water Access and Compliance Division. Inside was a single-page notice. The dock located at the property adjacent to hers, listed by parcel ID, was scheduled for a formal inspection, due to an administrative review of structural and spatial compliance. No names were mentioned. No accusations made, but the message was clear. The same process that had been turned on Jessica without cause was now circling back toward its source, and this time, the concern was rooted in legitimate, documentable doubt. Karen's dock, far from being a pristine legacy structure, was a patched-together platform extending well past the legal boundary markers, with floating extensions and a set of added cleats that had never appeared in any permit file. It was common knowledge to many longtime residents that the dock had evolved organically over the years, bit by bit, without oversight. For a while, no one cared. But now, suddenly, it mattered. Jessica didn't celebrate, didn't gloat, didn't mention the inspection to anyone. Instead, she returned to her routine. She worked in the yard, cleaned the house, took quiet boat rides when she could, and made a conscious effort to keep her head down. Yet there was no mistaking the change in the air. People who had avoided her in previous weeks now offered small nods again. The man who ran the local hardware store asked if she needed anything for the dock. A couple from up the hill left a basket of tomatoes from their garden on her porch. The lake was a fickle place. Social tides turned on the thinnest of pretexts, but Jessica didn't mistake politeness for alliance. She knew where she stood, and she knew how fast it could flip again. The morning of the inspection arrived without fanfare. Jessica watched from her kitchen window as a pair of county vehicles pulled into Karen's gravel drive. 2 officials in reflective vests stepped out, clipboards in hand, and made their way to the dock with careful steps. Karen emerged shortly after, her posture rigid, her movements brisk as she tried to position herself in their line of sight without appearing obstructive. Jessica couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see the stiffness in Karen's shoulders, the way she gestured toward the lake, as if the water itself might testify on her behalf. The officials measured distances, took photographs, scribbled notes. It was all very procedural, but the presence of rules, when applied evenly, has a way of stripping away the illusion of untouchability. Karen, for the first time since this conflict began, looked genuinely unsure. Later that afternoon, Jessica received a phone call from Stephen. They found multiple compliance issues, he said without preamble. Structural overreach, no record of renewal in the past 6 years, and non-standard modifications. The dock was grandfathered in under old guidelines, but the extensions voided that immunity. They're issuing a notice of required adjustment, or full removal. Jessica didn't reply at first. She felt the weight of the words, not as a victory, but as confirmation that reason still functioned in the world, even in small, slow doses. "How long does she have?" she finally asked. 14 business days to respond, 30 to comply or face administrative removal. But she'll respond. People like her don't let go quietly. And Stephen was right. Karen responded not with legal appeals or quiet correction, but with escalation. The following day, a large white sign appeared near the edge of her yard, positioned just so it would be visible from the water and from Jessica's dock. The letters were stenciled in sharp, all-caps type. "Private property, trespassers will be prosecuted." It was a clear act of performative resistance, but it changed nothing. Jessica's property lines were fixed, her rights intact. Still, it was a reminder that though the county had intervened, the neighbor-to-neighbor dynamic remained raw, unhealed, and loaded with potential for further rupture. What Jessica didn't expect was the indirect fallout. Several days after the inspection, she began receiving anonymous flyers in her mailbox again. This time, they were angrier, less passive-aggressive, and more accusatory. Phrases like outsider influence, urban disruption, and abuse of local channels were scrawled in printed paragraphs beneath generic calls for protecting lake traditions. There were no signatures, no addresses, just language soaked in resentment. Jessica turned them all over to Stephen, who cataloged them and advised her to remain outwardly calm. "They're losing their grip," he said. "That's when noise replaces reason." The final push came in the form of a local community newsletter, one Jessica hadn't even known existed. A printed, stapled pamphlet delivered by hand and quietly distributed only to a select handful of residents. Inside was a section titled Neighborhood Challenges, in which Jessica's property was obliquely referenced as a recent disruption to shared spaces and a source of stress to long-term residents. Again, no names. But again, no doubt who the subject was. The editor of the newsletter? A friend of Karen's from her old book club, as Stephen quickly discovered. Jessica considered replying or writing a letter of her own, but she knew that to engage on their terms was to descend into the very theater they wanted her to occupy. Instead, she forwarded the newsletter to the county communications office, along with a brief statement that she was being publicly disparaged based on misrepresented circumstances now under official correction. The office responded within a day, requesting that any public references to ongoing county reviews be suspended until all proceedings were finalized. It wasn't a censure, but it was pressure, and Karen's camp, having danced too close to the edge of procedure, was now feeling the heat they themselves had summoned. In the following days, Karen's sign quietly disappeared. The newsletter issued no further additions, and the anonymous flyers stopped arriving. But Jessica didn't relax. Not because she expected retaliation, but because she had learned by now that victories in these environments were rarely clean. Resentment has a way of lingering in the roots, hiding beneath the soil of civility, waiting for the next spark. The only thing she could do was remain composed, factual, and vigilant. For the first time in weeks, she sat out on her dock one evening with a glass of tea and watched the sun slide down behind the tree line. The air was quiet, the lake calm, and the only sounds were the distant hum of insects and the slow lapping of water against the dock's frame. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel safe. But she did feel something closer to steady. This was the midpoint of whatever this story was, and she knew, deep down, that the second half would be even harder, because people like Karen didn't accept consequences. They resented them. And people who resented the erosion of their control didn't retreat. They regrouped. The lull that followed the county's inspection and the subsequent soft retreat of Karen's provocations felt more like a strategic pause than a surrender. Jessica had lived too long in the orbit of bureaucracies and political maneuvering to mistake silence for resolution. What she had temporarily won was not peace, it was recalibration. Karen was regrouping. That became clear one humid morning in early June when Jessica stepped outside to collect her mail and found a glossy envelope tucked amid the usual utility bills. The return address belonged to the Regional Office of Building and Code Compliance, a department she hadn't had contact with yet. The letter inside was as polished as it was absurd. A formal notice of inquiry concerning a potential unpermitted structure. Her dock. Again. Except this time, the complaint wasn't about mooring or shoreline infringement. It claimed the dock's foundation had been altered recently, citing suspected unauthorized renovations or reinforcements affecting shoreline stability. The phrasing was precise, legalistic, and unmistakably coordinated. This wasn't a fresh complaint. It was a second strike, filed through a different agency in an attempt to reframe the issue, using a different arm of regulation to keep the pressure alive. Jessica stared at the letter for several minutes, the words slowly calcifying into anger. She hadn't touched the dock's foundation since moving in. Any photographs from the previous county inspection would confirm that. The attempt was transparent, but it was also time-consuming, potentially costly, and a psychological blow. She immediately called Stephen, who listened quietly and then asked, "Does it mention who filed it?" She shook her head before realizing he couldn't see her. "No," she said, "but it doesn't need to. It's her. Again. Through someone else this time. She's casting the net wider." Stephen sighed, the fatigue in his voice unhidden. "They're trying to keep you off balance. Different departments, different claims, each one slightly varied so you can't shut the whole thing down with one response. She's playing a war of inches. She knows she's losing ground on the dock removal, so she's opening another front. And if that doesn't work, she'll open another." Jessica sat at the kitchen table, the morning sun turning everything too bright. She felt, for a moment, the tightrope beneath her. This wasn't just about persistence anymore. It was about endurance, about how long she could stay rational under constant, calculated pressure. The problem wasn't that she was breaking. It was that she was growing used to it. Stephen offered a new tactic. "We document, respond formally, then we request a full consolidation review. That way, any future complaints must be attached to a single open case. It slows them down, forces them to stop treating you like a moving target. If they want to keep attacking, they have to use one avenue at a time." The next day, they submitted the formal response to the building office, including photo evidence from the last inspection, a sworn affidavit from the inspector stating no recent changes had been made to the dock's foundation, and a personal request for departmental oversight against redundant or bad faith filings. Jessica didn't know if it would stop Karen, but at the very least it made her less of a soft target. But the pressure didn't stop with paper. Late one evening, while walking the perimeter of her property before locking up for the night, Jessica found a small pile of crushed oyster shells spread across her gravel path near the dock. The smell was sharp, sour, and out of place. No one near the lake had a reason to discard seafood this way, certainly not within 50 feet of a freshwater shoreline. She stared at the pile, trying to understand the message. Was it symbolic? Intended as trash? A subtle act of contamination? There was no way to prove it was intentional. No evidence linking it to Karen or anyone else, but the randomness was too specific. The shells were ground enough to slice into skin, yet placed in a way that avoided the direct walking path. Not a trap, a warning. Jessica cleaned the mess without photographing it. This time, she didn't report it. Not because it didn't matter, but because it didn't serve a purpose to treat every escalation like a battle. Some fights had to be disarmed by refusal. What she didn't expect was the community shift that followed. 3 days after the shell incident, an older neighbor, Mrs. Crenshaw, who lived across the lake and rarely spoke more than pleasantries, appeared at Jessica's gate with a plastic container of lemon bars and a quiet look of concern. "You don't know me well," she began, voice gentle but firm. "But I've lived here 39 years. I know when something smells wrong, and right now, this whole business around your place stinks to high heaven. I'm not one to stir things up, but Karen's been riling people up like it's some personal crusade. She used to pull this with a fellow named Curtis back in the 90s. Took him 2 years to get his dock approved because she kept filing noise complaints. I'm sorry you're going through this. I just wanted you to know, not everyone here is behind her. Jessica was caught off guard by the honesty, but it anchored her. This was the first unsolicited support she'd received from within the neighborhood. It wasn't loud, it wasn't political. It was a tray of lemon bars and a warning that the past was repeating itself, and that someone had noticed. The next escalation came from Karen directly. For the first time in weeks, she approached the property line while Jessica was outside working near the boat shed. Karen's steps were brisk, purposeful, her expression tightly controlled. You think you've won something? She asked without preamble. Jessica stood slowly, brushing off her gloves. I'm just maintaining my space, Karen. That's all I've ever done. Karen's eyes narrowed. You don't belong here. You've turned a quiet community into a legal circus. You've poisoned everything. Jessica's voice remained steady. I haven't poisoned anything. I've responded. There's a difference. Karen stepped closer, crossing just to the edge of Jessica's boundary marker. You filed on my dock. I requested a compliance review, Jessica said. Just like you did, several times. Karen didn't answer. For a moment, her jaw worked as if struggling to hold back something sharper, more volatile. Then she turned and walked away, but not before glancing over her shoulder with a final murmur. This isn't over. Jessica didn't respond. She didn't need to. The next week brought a letter from the county enforcement office. Karen had filed a formal challenge to the dock removal notice, requesting a delay based on historical usage and community reliance. But the challenge was denied. The evidence didn't support her claim, and the county noted that multiple unpermitted modifications had voided any prior exemptions. She now had 20 days to remove the structure or face involuntary demolition with added costs. From there, things deteriorated quickly. Karen started leaving her outdoor lights on all night, facing Jessica's property. She blasted music during the afternoons. Old orchestral recordings that echoed off the water with jarring intensity. On more than one occasion, she hosted daytime gatherings of people who parked along the narrow access road, blocking Jessica's exit for hours at a time. When Jessica contacted the sheriff's office about the obstruction, she was told they couldn't intervene unless there was an emergency. It's a civil matter, they said. Stephen reviewed her options. We could go for a restraining order, he said. But that ramps things up legally. You'd have to testify. She'd counter. It becomes courtroom drama. Jessica shook her head. Not yet. Instead, she filed a complaint with the County Noise Regulation Board and another with the local road commission. Both actions were procedural, quiet, and attached to growing documentation that Stephen had begun compiling into a case portfolio, just in case. Then, with no warning, the final administrative blow landed. Karen received a letter stating that her failure to comply with the dock removal order had triggered enforcement. Her dock was now slated for state-mandated removal within the next 14 days. The notice was firm, final, and unapologetic. The extensions had to go, all of them. She would be billed for the labor. She would not be reimbursed. Jessica didn't celebrate. She watched the machinery of accountability turn slowly, grinding forward despite every push to stop it. She saw the frustration in Karen's movements, the pacing, the increasingly aggressive gestures on her property, the silence from her usual allies. And most of all, she saw what happened when someone who had always operated through control finally encountered limits. There was no joy in it, only gravity, because Jessica knew this wasn't an end. It was the crack before the fracture, and the pressure hadn't lifted. It was gathering. The morning the removal crew arrived to dismantle Karen's dock, the lake felt heavier than usual, as if the air itself understood the weight of what was about to happen. The sky was low and streaked with slate-colored clouds, not yet stormy but indifferent to the comfort of sunlight. A county barge anchored offshore, and a small team of workers began unloading tools and securing the perimeter. Jessica watched from her kitchen window, her fingers wrapped tightly around a ceramic mug she'd been holding for nearly 20 minutes without taking a sip. She didn't want to be seen watching. She didn't want to be seen at all, but she couldn't look away. There was something almost sacred about this moment. Not because it was a punishment, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real, irrevocable, and thoroughly official. The structure that had stood for decades, extending illegally over shared water, asserting itself into space it was never permitted to occupy, was about to be reduced to lumber and bolts. Karen was nowhere in sight. Jessica returned to her workroom and tried to focus on her design drafts, but the soft thud of tools and the mechanical hum of the barge's winch filtered through the trees and dragged her back to the window again and again. By noon, most of the dock had been stripped, the floating platforms detached and stacked neatly on the barge. A few of the structural poles still remained, sunk deep in the lake bed, stubborn and slow to yield. The crew broke for lunch, leaving the dismantled skeleton jutting half-finished into the water, and that's when Karen appeared. She stepped out from her porch wearing a blue windbreaker zipped to the neck, her posture erect, her movements deliberate. She didn't storm. She didn't shout. She simply walked down to the water's edge and stood there, arms folded, looking at what remained of the dock like it was the remnants of something sacred that had been desecrated. Jessica, caught off guard by the sight, moved away from the window. She didn't want to witness what might come next. But then she heard it, the sharp crack of wood hitting pavement, followed by a voice. It wasn't loud, but it carried. Karen was speaking to the workers, not yelling, but firmly, telling them they were making a mistake, that they would be liable, that she had pending paperwork, and that what they were doing constituted destruction of personal property. One of the workers responded quietly, and then another, more senior in tone, reminded her that the removal order had come from the county and that they were under legal obligation to complete the job. Karen didn't move. She stood there as if her presence alone could halt the progress, as if sheer will might substitute for legal standing. Jessica forced herself to sit down, deliberately turning her back on the lake, trying to disengage emotionally from a scene that had taken months to culminate. This wasn't her fight anymore. It had never truly been personal, at least not from her side, but it had become impossible not to feel the emotional echoes of someone else's unraveling. Karen had spent years shaping the neighborhood in her image, defining the rules, enforcing silence, constructing boundaries both physical and social. She had built more than a dock. She had built a system of influence rooted in intimidation and the slow erosion of resistance. And now, in the span of a few county-authorized hours, that structure was being taken apart in front of her. By mid-afternoon, the dock was gone. All that remained were the discolored patches where the boards had once rested and a few irregular holes in the soil leading out to the water. The workers loaded the last of the debris, secured the barge, and left without ceremony. Karen stood for a while longer, then returned to her house without looking in Jessica's direction. There were no final words, no shouted threats, no dramatic proclamations. Just retreat. And that, in its quiet way, was louder than anything else that might have occurred. Jessica didn't tell anyone what she felt in that moment. Not Stephen, who called later that evening to confirm the removal had been processed without incident. Not the neighbors who left another round of vegetables on her porch. Not even herself, really, because what she felt wasn't relief. It was a strange, brittle silence that settled inside her. Not hollow, not empty, but reflective, like the aftershock of a long-forgotten impact. But the conflict wasn't truly over. That became clear just days later when Jessica received a notice that a formal complaint had been filed against her property. Again. This time, it wasn't about the dock or the shoreline. It concerned her boat, specifically its anchoring system, which the complaint claimed created hazards to adjacent water users and violated local navigation decorum. The language was clumsy, amateur, and riddled with contradictions. It was clear this wasn't written by anyone with legal training or even a coherent argument. But it had been filed, and that meant it had to be processed. Stephen was furious. "She's scraping the bottom of the barrel now," he said. "This isn't even strategic. It's desperation." Jessica didn't disagree, but she also didn't flinch. She submitted her documentation, requested an expedited review, and copied the compliance officer from the previous dock inspection for context. Within 3 days, the complaint was dismissed. "Baseless," they wrote, "no further action warranted." Karen didn't reappear. Her house remained shuttered most days. The lights were off more often than not. No guests. No signs of activity beyond the occasional flicker of a lamp in an upstairs window. The land that once radiated control and surveillance now felt withdrawn, reclusive, stripped of purpose. Jessica didn't feel triumphant. She felt wary. People like Karen didn't vanish. They paused. And when they returned, they often did so in ways no one could predict. So Jessica doubled down on her presence. She hosted 2 neighbors for coffee on her porch the following week. She invited the Crenshaws to bring their grandchildren by to fish from her dock, offering the kind of open gesture that subtly but unmistakably countered the isolation Karen had once tried to impose. She joined a local environmental initiative focused on preserving shoreline vegetation and volunteered to help with a trail restoration project along the southern curve of the lake. Not loudly, not with banners, just with quiet consistency. Because what Karen had tried to destroy wasn't just Jessica's right to her dock or her boat. It was her ability to belong without permission. And now, finally, she was beginning to. But the true culmination came one afternoon when Jessica returned home from a grocery run and found an envelope taped to her door. It wasn't official. No seal, just her name handwritten in shaky cursive. She opened it slowly, expecting another unsigned letter, another veiled insult. But it wasn't a threat. It was an apology, of sorts. The note read, "I see now that maybe I didn't know everything I thought I did. Doesn't mean I agree with how you do things, but it wasn't all your fault. You pushed back, and you didn't break. Most people don't last here. I still think you don't belong, but you're not weak. I respect that, even if I don't like it. Don't expect a second note." It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. Jessica stood on her porch, the letter in hand, the wind brushing lightly against her shoulder, and she realized that in some strange, fractured way, that note marked the end. Not reconciliation, not peace, but an acknowledgement. A final flicker of resistance giving way to reluctant respect. And for Jessica, that was enough. Because she hadn't come here to win, she'd come here to live. And now, at last, she could. The lake, by late summer, had softened into its gentler rhythms. Longer shadows over glassy water, cooler breezes whispering through the trees in the early evening, and a hush settling across the shoreline that only came when the seasonal noise of out-of-town boaters finally gave way to the familiarity of year-round life. Jessica had grown used to the changing moods of this place. She had learned to read the small shifts, to anticipate the quiet before another complaint, the pause before the next escalation. But now, for the first time in months, the quiet felt different. It didn't feel like the eye of a storm. It felt earned. Karen's house stood as it always had, its manicured hedges still trimmed, its windows still adorned with the same pale curtains, but its dock was gone, and with it, the power that had once radiated from its perch. There was no ceremony in the aftermath, no announcements or apologies, but the absence of her structure was as loud as any declaration. It marked the boundary not just of her property, but of her reach. In the days that followed the dismantling and the silent delivery of that final, unsigned note, Karen became an invisible presence, no longer the sentinel of the lakeside, but a figure that drifted at its edges, acknowledged, perhaps even tolerated, but no longer obeyed. Jessica didn't seek to fill the vacuum that had been left behind. She didn't volunteer to chair any community committee, didn't post anything on local boards, didn't throw parties or invite recognition. What she did was resume living. She painted the shed at the edge of her property a soft gray that matched the stone path leading to the dock. She replaced the old bench near the waterline with a sturdy teak one she ordered from a catalog and spent several weekends assembling herself. She reinforced the mooring for her boat, not because it was necessary, but because she wanted it to reflect the same sense of permanence she now felt when she walked across the planks of her dock. She made repairs slowly, intentionally, not with haste or urgency, but with care. The kind of care you give to something that you intend to keep. Neighbors began to stop by, unannounced but welcome. Mrs. Crenshaw brought over a box of old photographs she had taken of the lake over the years, including one from the 1980s that showed Jessica's dock in almost the exact same condition as it stood today. Cliff, the retired mechanic who had helped her with the boat in the spring, dropped off a sealed box of spare parts and tools without a word, simply nodding once as he left it on her porch. The Crenshaws invited her for supper one Saturday evening, and she went, bringing a bottle of wine and a dessert she had nervously baked from her grandmother's recipe. It wasn't a grand reintegration. It was quiet, like everything else here. But it was real. Stephen called less frequently now, though when he did, the conversations had shifted in tone. They talked about trails near the lake, about local elections, about the possibility of expanding her property line by applying for a variance. He mentioned offhandedly that he was considering buying a cabin somewhere nearby, maybe not directly on the lake, but close enough to feel the wind off the water. Jessica didn't read too much into the comment, but she didn't dismiss it either. Life, after all, was unpredictable, and not all surprises were threats. The boat, once a symbol of conflict, became what it had always been intended to be, a vessel of calm. Jessica took it out often, not far, just enough to feel the drift of the current and the hum of the engine beneath her. She brought a book sometimes, a thermos of tea, a pair of binoculars to watch the osprey nests along the northern shore. One evening, she saw Karen standing at her window, her silhouette outlined against the fading orange of the sunset. They didn't wave. They didn't acknowledge each other. But Jessica didn't flinch. She didn't retreat. She simply turned back to the water and continued on. That fall, during a community cleanup initiative, Jessica quietly volunteered to maintain a neglected section of trail that ran behind her property. It wasn't a big job, just clearing brush, placing markers, ensuring safe passage for hikers and dog walkers. But the gesture was noticed. A local newspaper, circulated only in print and mostly read by retirees, featured a small photo of the project in progress. Jessica appeared in the background, unposed and unaware. The caption didn't mention her by name. But that wasn't the point. What mattered was the message. She was here. She was a part of this place, and she had chosen to contribute rather than divide. Winter came slowly that year, with a softness that didn't match the sharpness of the months that preceded it. Frost lined the dock rails and the water darkened with the season. But Jessica remained. She prepped the boat for storage, sealed the edges of the windows, and stocked her firewood. She knew how to endure. She had learned not just how to survive in a place that resisted her, but how to shape her own space within it, without apology, without force. On the first snow, she walked down to the edge of the lake alone, the crunch of boots the only sound in the stillness. The water was half frozen, the sky wide and gray, and for a long time she simply stood there, breathing in the cold, her breath rising in pale clouds. There was no plaque, no flag, no sign of battle won, only the steady presence of her dock, her land, her place. She touched the wooden rail, closed her eyes briefly, and let the silence settle around her like armor. In the end, it hadn't been about a dock or a boat, or even the woman who had tried to push her out. It had been about something deeper. The right to exist without permission. The right to claim space not by dominating it, but by inhabiting it fully and without fear. Jessica had never sought to change the lake, only to live beside it. And in doing so, Without aggression, without surrender, she had become part of it. That was her victory. Not the silence that followed, but the stillness she had made her own.